2 weeks before I signed the power of attorney papers that would have handed my daughter-in-law control over everything Frank and I spent 40 years building. I was sitting in Darlene's chair at the hair salon on Concession Street when she leaned down close to my ear and said, very quietly, "Don't react, just listen to me." I had been coming to Shea Grace every 6 weeks since 2009. Darlene had done my hair the morning of Frank's funeral. She had done it the week I sold his truck because I couldn't look at it in the driveway anymore. She knew things about my life that I had never told anyone directly. The kind of things that come out sideways when someone is washing your hair and the water is warm and you're not quite looking at each other. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of afternoon in Hamilton where the light goes gold and flat, and the maples on the street are the only thing still trying. I had come in for a color touch-up and to get out of the house, which had been too quiet since my son and his wife had started calling more often. I should have recognized what that meant earlier. I didn't. Darlene's hands had gone still on my shoulders. She was looking at me in the mirror with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not alarm, exactly. Something more careful than that. "My next client called ahead," she said, still in that low voice. "She's the receptionist at Holloway and Finch. That's the financial planning office 2 doors down." She paused. "She told me something before she came in, and I've been sitting with it for an hour trying to figure out what to do." I looked at her in the mirror. "Your daughter-in-law was in their office this morning," Darlene said, "with a man my client didn't recognize. She overheard them talking through the glass partition. She wasn't trying to." Darlene set down the color brush. "They were talking about you." The salon was quiet. Someone's dryer was running at the far end of the room. I could hear the street outside. "She said your daughter-in-law told this man that the cognitive decline had been documented." That word, documented. And that once the POA was in place, the timeline to liquidate the RRSP and the house could move quickly because you wouldn't have legal standing to object. I did not move. "She said your daughter-in-law used the phrase, 'She trusts him completely. He'll bring her anything to sign.'" Darlene's voice was steady, but her hands were not. "My client thought she meant your son." The dryer kept running. A woman laughed somewhere behind me. I sat in the chair under the plastic cape and looked at my own face in the mirror and thought, so that's what this has been. Frank died 22 months before that Thursday. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 38 years. We had built a life in the city the way you build things when you don't come from money, carefully, slowly, one decision at a time. The house on Queenston Road we bought in 1991. The RRSP we contributed to every single year, even when there wasn't much to contribute. Frank's life insurance policy, which he had kept paying into quietly without telling me how large it had grown, because he said he didn't want me to think about it that way. I was 64 years old. I had taught secondary school English for 31 years. I was not confused. I was not declining. I was grieving, which is a different thing entirely, though I was beginning to understand that someone had decided those two things looked the same from the outside and that this was useful to them. I drove home in the flat October light and sat in the kitchen without turning on the overhead lamp. The house smelled like the cedar chips I kept in the closets and the last of the basil I'd grown on the windowsill. Frank's reading glasses were still on the side table in the living room. I hadn't moved them. I knew that wasn't healthy, but I had not moved them. My son, 39 years old, I had raised him alone for 4 years after my first marriage ended, and then with Frank from the time he was 8, and Frank had loved him straightforwardly and without reservation in the way that good stepfathers sometimes do when they decide to simply commit. My son had grown into a decent man. I believed that. I still needed to understand whether I still could. His wife. They had been together 6 years, married for 3. She had come into our lives already knowing things, the right questions to ask, the right tone to use with older people, how to seem attentive without being present. I had liked her. I had told Frank I liked her. He had been quieter about it than I expected him to be, and I had not asked him to explain. 8 months earlier, my son had told me he was worried about me. He had sat at this kitchen table and said gently that some of the things I'd mentioned, a missed dentist appointment in March, a moment in June when I had briefly forgotten the name of a colleague I'd worked with for 12 years, suggested I might want to get ahead of things. Plan properly. He had said, "Mum, Dad would have wanted you to be protected." He had brought a folder. Inside was the name of a financial planner, Terence Voss of Holloway and Finch. I had been touched. I had believed it was love. I called my friend Beverly that night. Beverly Chow had been my closest friend since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class at Ryerson Public School. She had retired from the school board 2 years before I did and had spent the intervening time learning things, the tax implications of estate transfers, the difference between a continuing power of attorney and a healthcare directive, the specific protections available to seniors under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act. Beverly was the person you called when something needed to be understood correctly before you acted on it. She answered on the first ring. I told her everything. The salon, Darlene, the receptionist, the words my daughter-in-law had used. The phrase, liquidate the RRSP. The phrase, she won't have standing. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need to call Susan Price." Susan Price had handled Frank's estate. She was 61, had practiced elder law in Hamilton for 18 years before moving into general estates work, and had the particular manner of someone who had spent 2 decades watching financial abuse happen to good people and had developed a precise and unsentimental response to it. I had liked her without quite understanding her when we worked together after Frank died. I understood her better now. I called her office at 8 the next morning. Her assistant put me through within 20 minutes. I told Susan what I had heard, the planning office, 2 doors from the salon, my daughter-in-law and a man whose name I didn't yet know, the documentation of decline that did not exist, the timeline to liquidate. Susan said, "Do not sign anything. Do not tell your son you know. Come to my office today at 2 o'clock." I did not sleep that night in the usual way. I sat in the armchair by the window in the bedroom, Frank's chair, and looked at the maple tree in the front yard, and thought about the months leading up to that Thursday. The dentist appointment I'd missed in March. I had mentioned it to my son. The moment at the grocery store when I'd stood in the coffee aisle trying to remember whether Frank had preferred one brand or another and had started crying quietly in front of the whole bean display. I told my son about that too, one evening on the phone, in the way you tell your children things when you're lonely and they seem to want to know how you are. I thought now about who else had been in the room when my son was on the phone. I thought about what a list of those moments might look like if someone had been writing them down. I thought about Terence Voss, the financial planner my son had recommended. I'd met with him 3 times. Each meeting had been pleasant and clear, and not once had he mentioned fees. Not once had he walked me through what a power of attorney granted to my son, and by extension to my son's wife, would actually authorize them to do. I thought about my daughter-in-law, the way she always seemed to know slightly more about the conversation than she should, the way she positioned herself as an interpreter between me and my son, saying things like, "What your mom means is," in a tone that was always helpful and never quite accurate. I thought about Frank, and the way he had looked at her, the one time she had corrected me at dinner about something I had said about my own career. He hadn't said anything, he had just looked. Susan's office was on King Street West, above an insurance broker that had been there since before I moved to Hamilton. She met me at the door and closed the blinds before we sat down, which I noticed and appreciated. I showed her the power of attorney document Terence Voss had prepared. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, with a pen in her hand that she did not use. "There's a clause here," she said, setting it on the desk and pointing to page 3. "A continuing power of attorney for property, which is standard. But this version includes a provision granting your son's spouse authority as an alternate attorney without requiring your separate written consent. It's buried in the language of Section 6 under succession. Did Voss explain this to you?" "No." "Did your son?" "No." She set the document aside. "Tell me more about what was said in the planning office, specifically the word documented." I told her everything I remembered. She wrote on a legal pad. When I finished, she asked whether I had noticed any genuine changes in my cognition over the past several months. And she asked it carefully, in a way that made clear she wanted an honest answer and not a defensive one. I thought about it honestly. There had been some things, the missed appointment, the grocery store, a moment in August when I had misread the date on a form and had not caught it until the following day, small things that had frightened me mildly and that I had attributed to grief. Who knew about those incidents? Susan asked. My son, his wife, and I mentioned the August form to Terence Voss in our last meeting when he asked how I was managing day to day. Susan put her pen down. Someone has been collecting information about you, not to help you, to establish a paper record that could be used to challenge any attempt on your part to revoke this document after signing. She stood and walked to her bookshelf. Under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act, a grantor can revoke a power of attorney at any time while they have capacity. The way to prevent a revocation is to establish that the grantor no longer has capacity. If someone were to arrange a cognitive assessment before the document was revoked and document impairment that doesn't actually exist, a subsequent revocation could be legally challenged. She looked at me. We need to move carefully, and we need evidence beyond what you overheard secondhand. I know someone who can help with that. She wrote a name on a piece of paper. Clifford O'Say, former Ontario Securities Commission investigator, 14 years. He's private now. He's thorough and he doesn't advertise. I took the paper. What about the signing? It's scheduled for Monday. You're going to call your son this evening and tell him you've had a headache and need a few more days to look things over. Nothing alarming. You need 72 hours. I drove home along Queenston Road past the arena where my son had played hockey every Saturday morning for 7 years, past the library where Frank had taken him on Tuesday evenings when he was small. I pulled into the driveway under the maple we had planted the year we moved in. I sat in the car for a while before going inside. I called my son at 5. His voice was warm and easy. He said, of course, no rush, whatever I needed. He said, I just want to make sure you're okay, Mom. I said I knew that. I said I loved him. I held the phone after we hung up and tried to hold two things at once. That his voice had sounded entirely genuine, and that genuine was not the same as innocent. Clifford Assay arrived at my house the following morning wearing a grey fleece that made him look more like a retired schoolteacher than a former investigator. He was 63, quiet, and had the quality of someone who had spent a career measuring the distance between what people said and what they had actually done. I told him everything from the beginning. He took notes without expression. When I finished, he asked for the power of attorney document, Voss's business card, my son's full name and employer, and my daughter-in-law's full name, including any previous surnames. One question, he said at my front door. Your son. Do you believe he knows the full scope of what's being planned, or do you think he believes this is standard estate protection? I thought about my son at my kitchen table in February. The folder, the way he had looked at me when he said Frank would have wanted this, the particular quality of his concern, which had felt real. I don't know, I said. That's the thing I need to understand most. Clifford nodded. That's the right thing to need to understand. Beverly came over that evening and we sat at the kitchen table and went through 8 months of documents Terence Voss had sent me. We laid them out in order. The initial consultation summary in January, the trust outline in March, the asset transfer framework in July, the power of attorney package 2 weeks ago, each document slightly more complex than the last, each one following logically from the previous. Beverly said, he walked you one step at a time. He knew you were grieving. He knew you'd defer to your son. He built the whole thing on that. At 9:45, my phone showed a message from Clifford. It said, found more than I expected. Can you have your lawyer there tomorrow at noon? Susan arrived at 11:50. Clifford arrived at noon. He set 3 folders on my kitchen table. The first folder was Terence Voss. He had a regulatory with the Ontario Securities Commission, a complaint filed in 2019 by a client in Burlington, 71 years old, who had lost over $180,000 in undisclosed management fees inside a discretionary investment account before her nephew intervened. The complaint had been settled. The terms were sealed. There was a second matter, a client in Kitchener in 2021. Same demographic, same structure. Both women had recently lost their husbands. Both had adult children who had introduced them to Voss. Susan looked at the fee schedule inside my document. The management structure he's proposing here, she said, tapping page 5, is the same percentage arrangement used in the Burlington case. 2.5% annually on total assets under management, with a separate hourly billing rate for transactions over $25,000. On assets of this size, we're looking at approximately $20,000 a year in fees alone, none of which was disclosed to you. The second folder was my daughter-in-law. Before she married my son, she had worked as a financial services administrator at an investment firm in Mississauga. Clifford had spoken to a former colleague. She had left that position in 2019 following an internal compliance review related to client account documentation. Nothing was prosecuted. There was no record. But she understood how these documents worked. She understood how these documents worked. She understood which clauses transferred authority and which language concealed fees. The third folder was the worst. There was a name on it. Dr. Raymond Chowke, a general practitioner in Ancaster, with a certificate in geriatric assessment obtained 18 months ago. He had not been mentioned to me directly. Clifford had found his name in an email exchange Terence Voss had sent to my daughter-in-law's personal address, which her former colleague had forwarded to Clifford off the record. Dr. Chowke, Clifford said carefully, is not a geriatric specialist. He is a GP who took a weekend accreditation course. He has provided cognitive assessment reports in 2 other POA-related matters in the past 2 years, both involving women over 65, both involving the same Voss management structure. He paused. One of those women no longer lives in her home. Her son sold it 14 months ago. She is currently in a long-term care facility in Stony Creek. Her family manages what remains of her finances. I looked at the third folder for a long time. Susan said, "Was there any indication your son knew about Chowke?" Clifford considered this carefully. "Nothing I found puts your son in direct contact with Chowke or in knowledge of his role. Your son signed one form as an alternate attorney designate. He may face questions, but based on what I found, the arrangement appears to have originated with Voss and your daughter-in-law, with your son presented with a version that looked like straightforward estate planning." I sat with that. "What do we do now?" Beverly asked. I had been thinking about that since the night I sat in Frank's chair in the dark. I had thought about calling my son alone first. I had thought about simply not signing and letting the whole thing collapse quietly. I had thought about every approach that didn't require standing in a room and making people look at what they had done. And then I thought about the woman in Stony Creek, her house sold, her money gone, her children satisfied. I said, "I want to reschedule the signing for Sunday afternoon at my house. Tell them I'm ready. Invite my son and his wife and Voss for what they think is the final meeting." Susan looked at me steadily. And then I finish it," I said. "I spent Saturday making the house very clean. I made Frank's lemon loaf, the recipe he had kept on a lined index card in his handwriting in the kitchen drawer, the one he had made every Sunday morning of our marriage. I let it fill the house with that smell. I sat at his desk in the study and looked at his photograph and told him what I was about to do. I told him I was frightened. I told him the frightened part didn't change anything." Beverly arrived at 1 o'clock. My neighbor my neighbor Ken, who had been a Crown attorney for 26 years and who I trusted with the specific trust you extend to someone who has been shoveling your walk every winter without being asked, arrived at 1:30. Susan was already there with a colleague. Clifford sat in the corner with his briefcase. At 10 to 3, I heard a car in the driveway. I watched through the kitchen window as my son and his wife came up the front walk. My son was carrying a leather portfolio. His wife had her hair down and was wearing the grey blazer she wore to things she considered important. Terence Voss's car pulled in behind theirs. I opened the door and smiled. My son hugged me. He smelled like the same cedar soap he had used since university, the kind I'd started buying for him because Frank liked it. He said, "You look good. How's the head?" "Better," I said. "Come in. I made lemon loaf." His wife hugged me and said the house smelled wonderful and called me by a nickname she had given me herself early in the relationship, before I understood the purpose of small familiarities. Terence Voss shook my hand. He had the handshake of a man who had done this many times and expected the next hour to go very smoothly. I led them into the dining room. The table was set. The paperwork was laid out. Susan and Beverly and Ken were seated along the far wall. Voss looked at the number of people in the room and recovered too quickly for it to be natural. "Before we start," he said, setting his briefcase down, "I'd like to do a final walkthrough of the document, just to make sure everyone—" "I'd like to say something first," I said. He gestured for me to go ahead. I looked at my son. He was watching me with the careful, patient attention of a person who believes they are managing a situation. 38 years ago," I said, "your father sat at this table and told me that the most important thing two people can do is tell each other the truth, even when it costs something. He was not a man who was easy to fool. He was also not a man who let important things go unsaid." I looked at my son. I have been trying to be more like him. My son's expression softened. His wife's hands were flat on the table. I nodded to Clifford. He opened his briefcase and placed 3 folders on the table. I looked at Terence Voss. 3 weeks ago, you provided me with a power of attorney document containing a management fee structure of 2.5% annually on all assets under management, plus a separate billing rate for transactions over $25,000. You did not explain this to me. Neither did my son, because my son did not know it was there. My son turned to look at Voss. "What is she talking about?" Voss said, "Margaret, I think there's been some confusion about how the fee disclosures work. If we could review the document together." Susan said clearly, "The fee structure is on page 5, section 3.1, in a paragraph headed Standard Fiduciary Provisions. The same structure appeared in a complaint filed against Mr. Jumper Voss with the Ontario Securities Commission in 2019, arising from a Burlington client who lost $180,000 in undisclosed fees. The complaint was settled. Mr. Voss's license was not revoked." My son stared at Voss. I opened the first folder and turned it to face my son, Voss's name at the top. The OSC complaint. 2 prior clients, 2 widows, same paperwork, same sequence. My son's face went very still. His wife's hands did not move. "I want to tell you about your wife's history," I said, and I looked at my daughter-in-law directly for the first time since they had arrived. Her face was composed in the way of someone who is prepared for the possibility of this and decided that stillness is their best option. "Before your marriage," I said, "she worked in financial services administration in Mississauga. She left that position following a compliance review related to client account documentation. She was not prosecuted. There is no public record, but she knows exactly how these documents work, which clauses transfer authority, which language buries fees, which provisions make it difficult for a grantor to revoke." I paused. "She introduced you to Terence Voss. She suggested this specific structure. She framed it to you as protecting me, because you love me, and she understood that you would do anything if she told you it was for my protection." His wife said, "This is a complete mischaracterization of everything I've done for this family." My son was looking at the folder in front of him. I could not see his face. Beverly placed a printed email on the table. "And then there is Dr. Raymond Chalker," I said. Terence Voss stood up. "I don't think we need to continue." Susan said, "Please sit down, Mr. Voss. 2 officers from the Hamilton Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit are currently parked in front of this house. They have been briefed on this matter. If you leave this room, I will make 1 phone call." Voss sat down. "Dr. Chalker," I said, "holds a general practice license in Ontario and an 18-month-old weekend certification in geriatric assessment. He was scheduled to evaluate my cognitive capacity after I signed these documents, not before. The evaluation was not to protect me. It was to create a retroactive record that could be used to challenge any attempt by me to revoke the power of attorney once I understood what I had signed." My son said very quietly, "Mom." I looked at him. His face had gone pale. He was looking at the email Beverly had placed in front of him, not at his wife, not at Voss. He said, "I didn't know about any doctor." "I know," I said. His wife said, "You have to understand, we talked about this, you agreed." He put his hand up. He didn't look at her. Two people have already lost everything to this pattern, I said, looking at the room. A woman in Burlington lost $180,000. A woman in Stony Creek sold her home 14 months ago and is now in a long-term care facility in this city, while her family uses what is left of her retirement savings to pay for it. Neither of them did anything wrong. They trusted the people who were supposed to love them, and they trusted the people those people recommended to them. The room was quiet. I want to be clear about something, I said. I am not confused. I am not in decline. I am not someone who requires management or protection from her own decisions. I am 64 years old. I taught English to teenagers for 31 years. I buried a good man, and I have run my own life since then, with clarity and without assistance. No one in this room or anywhere else is entitled to decide otherwise. Susan stood. Terence Voss, you are being referred to the Ontario Securities Commission for investigation of elder financial abuse, undisclosed fee structures, and conspiracy. Dr. Chowker will be separately referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. I am recommending criminal charges under Section 331 of the Criminal Code of Canada. She looked at my daughter-in-law. The question of your direct involvement is currently under active review. The officers came to the door. Voss left without speaking. He looked, in the end, very small and very ordinary, which is the thing about people who do this. They are never remarkable except in the precision of their timing. My daughter-in-law looked at my son. Her composure had slipped in the way that composure slips when it was a performance to begin with, and the audience has left. She said, I was trying to build something for us. You know what I make. You know what we owe. I wasn't trying to hurt her. You know that. My son did not respond. She picked up her bag and walked past me without meeting my eyes and let herself out through the front door. I listened to her car back out of the driveway. The room was quiet for a long time. Ken poured water. Beverly sat down beside me. Susan gathered documents the way she always did, efficiently, without drama. My son had not moved. His portfolio was still on the table in front of him, unopened, the one he had carried up the front walk, believing the afternoon would go differently. He said, Mom, I'm so sorry. I sat down beside him. He said, I thought I was helping. When she said you were forgetting things, when she told me Voss was the best in the city, when she brought me the paperwork and said this was what responsible children do for their parents. He stopped. I wanted to be responsible. I wanted to do for you what Dad would have done if he were here. He put his hands over his face. I went around you instead of to you. I let someone tell me you'd already started to slip, and I didn't ask you once whether it was true. No, I said, you didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I need you to know something, he said. If I had known what was in those documents, what she'd done before, what Voss was. He stopped. I would never, for anything. I looked at my son, 39 years old, Frank's jaw and Frank's hands, and the same quality Frank had always had of being completely unable to hide what he was feeling. Frank had loved that about him from the beginning. So had I. I believe you, I said. But, I said, you let someone tell you I was fading. You let someone turn your grief about losing your father into a reason to take over instead of showing up. You made decisions around me instead of with me, because somewhere you had already decided I needed to be decided for. I looked at him. That part we need to talk about. Not today, but soon. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was its own kind of answer. In the weeks that followed, the quiet came back to the house on Queenston Road. Not the hollow, waiting quiet of the 22 months since Frank. Something more settled than that. Darlene called once a week. Beverly came for dinner on Tuesdays. Ken shoveled the walk on the first snowfall in November without being asked, same as always. Terence Voss surrendered his investment advisor registration to the OSC in December, pending a full investigation. Criminal charges were laid in January. The woman in Stony Creek had a lawyer now. Susan had made the connection. The woman from Burlington had been contacted. Through the investigation, 4 other women came forward. None of them people I knew. All of them women who had been alone and had trusted the wrong person at a vulnerable moment. Whatever happened in court, that part felt like enough. Dr. Chalke's license was suspended in November pending a college review. He declined to comment publicly. My son called twice a week, and the calls got slightly longer each time. He told me in December that he had started seeing a counselor. He said she was helping him understand something about how he had handled the 2 years since his father's death, how he had needed to feel useful and had confused usefulness with control. He asked if he could come for Christmas. I said yes. He arrived with a poinsettia, which he had never done before, and spent the afternoon in the kitchen with me going through Frank's recipe box, the real one, the index cards in Frank's handwriting that I kept in the drawer by the stove. We made the lemon loaf together, and then the shortbread, because it turned out Frank had written that one down too, and I had never known. After dinner, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug of tea and said, "My counselor asked me when I stopped thinking you could handle things on your own. I didn't have an answer. I think it started right after Dad died, when I needed you to be struggling so that helping you would mean something." I listened. He said, "She asked me if I'd ever actually asked you how you were doing instead of assessing how you were doing. I couldn't think of a single time in the past 2 years." He looked at me. "That's on me. I know that." I thought about Frank and the way he had talked to me, directly, without softening things past the point of truth. I said, "Your father was never afraid to be honest with me, even when it cost him something. I'd like it if we could find our way to something like that." My son looked at his mug for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "me too." On a Sunday in the new year, I drove to the cemetery on the mountain. The escarpment was grey and bare, and the sky was that particular Hamilton winter white that isn't quite overcast and isn't quite clear. I sat with Frank for a while. I told him about the salon, the folders on the table, the officers at the door. I told him his son was going to be all right. I told him I was all right. I told him the house was still ours, the way it had always been ours, the way I had decided it was going to stay. The wind came off the escarpment the way it always does in January, sharp and direct and indifferent to what you think about it. I sat there until my hands were cold. Then I drove home the long way, down the mountain and through the old neighborhoods, and over the bridge where the creek runs fast in winter, and pulled into the driveway under the maple that is older now than my son was when we planted it. I went inside and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen in the quiet that was mine. There is something I've been sitting with since the afternoon. Everything came apart at my own dining room table. I thought at the time that the hardest part was Voss and what he had planned, or the document with its buried clauses, or the name of a doctor already reviewing a file about my mind. The hardest part was my son, not what he did, what he had already quietly decided about me before any of it started. The way he had looked at my grief and my closed door and decided without asking that I had already become someone who needed to be managed from the outside. I didn't make it easy. I know that. After Frank died, I went inward the way I always do when things hurt, and I kept my son at a distance because distance had always been how I protected myself when I wasn't coping. I chose independence over connection because independence was the thing I knew how to perform. He looked at my closed door and read it as decline. That was his mistake. But I helped make the space for it. The people who do what Voss did, who build structures around grief and solitude and the particular vulnerability of being older and alone, they need an opening. Sometimes that opening arrives with a briefcase, but sometimes it begins long before that, with a mother and a child who stopped being honest with each other and left a door standing open that neither of them meant to leave. Don't let that door stay closed. Whatever it costs you to keep it open, it costs less than what walks through when the wrong people find it. I keep coming back to the moment Darlene's hands went still on my shoulders. Not the courtroom language, not the 3 folders on my dining room table, not even the look on my son's face when he understood what had been done in his name. Just that moment in the mirror, her eyes, and the careful way she chose to say something when she could have chosen not to. That choice cost her nothing materially, but it required something that is harder to come by than most people admit, the integrity to act on what you know, even when it's easier to stay quiet. Darlene didn't know me beyond 6 weeks of appointments and whatever I'd let slip while she worked. She had no obligation. She had a business to protect, a schedule to keep, a client sitting in her chair who might not believe her or might not want to. She said something anyway. That's what moral courage actually looks like when it isn't dramatic. It's a woman setting down a color brush and deciding that doing the right thing matters more than what happens next. I think about what would have happened if she hadn't. I had been told I was forgetting things. I had been told gently and repeatedly that I needed protection, and I had believed it, not because I was naive, but because grief does something particular to your sense of your own reliability. You start to wonder, you start to defer, you sign things, and the people who understand that mechanism, who have studied it the way Terence Foss had studied it, they count on that window staying open. What closed it was the part of me that had spent 31 years teaching young people to read carefully, to question what they were told, to ask who benefits from a particular version of a story. I had taught those skills for decades, and then, in the fog of losing Frank, I had stopped applying them to my own life. When I finally did, when I sat across from Susan and read page 5 and understood what I was looking at, it wasn't instinct. It was a skill I had built and kept and had to choose to use. That kind of clear-eyed thinking doesn't protect you automatically. You have to decide to trust it, even when someone you love has told you not to. And then there is the part about endurance, not the dramatic kind, not standing at the head of the table while Voss's face changed. The harder kind, sitting in Frank's chair at 2 in the morning, not knowing whether my son was someone I could still trust. Driving home past the arena and the library and all the places that were ours, and holding everything steady anyway. Making lemon loaf on a Saturday and letting it fill the house because some things need to be preserved, even when you're frightened, especially when you're frightened. My son is getting better. We are getting better. That's happening because he had the honesty to look at what he had done, not what had been done to him, not what his wife had arranged, but his own quiet decision to manage me from a distance instead of knowing me from up close. That took something from him. I watched it cost him, and I think it will be the most useful thing that ever happened to him, not because suffering is inherently instructive, but because he chose to learn from it instead of explaining it away. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that the three things that protected me weren't luck or connections or the right phone number. They were the willingness to act honestly even when it was frightening, the discipline to think clearly when someone needed me to stop thinking, and the stubbornness to keep going when it would have been easier to sign the paper and let the whole thing be someone else's problem. Those are the things worth protecting, not the house, not the RRSP, those.